Chapter 3 Cutler's Tavern. Lyddie stood outside the gate, waiting until Luke and his wagon disappeared around the curve of the road. Then she watched a pair of swallows dive and soar around the huge chimney in the center of the main house. The tavern was much larger. The tavern was larger than the Stevensons' farmhouse. Addition after addition, porch, shed, and a couple of barns, the end one at least 4 stories high. The whole complex, recently painted with a mix of red ochre and buttermilk, stood against the sky like a row of giant beets popped clear of the earth. The pastures, a lush new green, were dotted with merino sheep and fat milk cows. There was a huge sugar maple in front of what must be the parlor door, and another at the porch, which, from the presence of churns and cooling pans, must lead into the kitchen. Once I walk in that gate, I ain't free anymore, she thought. No matter how handsome the house, once I enter, I'm a servant girl, no more than a black slave. She had been queen of the cabin and the straggly fields and sugar bush up there on the hill. But now someone else would call the tune. How could her mother have done such a thing? She was sure her father would be horrified. She and Charlie drudges on someone else's place. It didn't matter that plenty of poor people put out their children for hire to save having to feed them. She and Charlie could have fed themselves. Just one good harvest, one good sugaring. That was all they needed, and they could have stayed together. She was startled out of her dreaming by a hideous roar, and before she could figure out what animal could have made such a noise, a stagecoach appeared, drawn by 2 spans of sweating Morgan horses, shaking their great heads, showing their fierce teeth, saliva foaming on their iron bits. The coach had rounded the curve, its horn bellowing. The driver was yelling as well, and then, just in time, she realized that he was yelling at her. She jumped hard against the wall. He was still yelling back at her as he pulled up the reins, the coach itself now on the very spot where she had been standing seconds before. Should she apologize? No, he wasn't paying her any attention now. He was turning the team over to a boy who had run out of the shed. A woman was hurrying out of the kitchen door to welcome the passengers, who were climbing stiffly from the coach. Lyddie stared. They were very grand-looking. One of the gentlemen, a man in a beaver hat and frilled shirt, turned to hand a woman down the coach step. The lady's face was hidden by a fancy straw bonnet, the brim decorated with roses that matched her gown. Was it silk? Lyddie couldn't be sure, never having seen a real silk dress before, but it was smooth and pink like a baby's cheek. Around her shoulders the lady wore a shawl woven in a deeper shade of pink. Lyddie marveled that the woman would wear something so delicate for a ride to the Northland in a dusty coach. Safely on the ground, the woman lifted her head and looked about her. Her face was thin and white, her features elegant. She caught Lyddie's eyes and smiled. It was a very nice smile, not at all haughty. Lyddie realized that she had been staring. She closed her mouth and quickly looked away. When the encounter was over, for the stout woman who had come out of the kitchen door was hustling the lady, her escort, and 2 other passengers through the low gate and around to the main door at the north end of the tavern. Suddenly, she saw Lyddie. She came over to the wall and whispered hoarsely across it to her. "What are you doing here?" She was looking Lyddie up and down as she asked, as though Lyddie were a stray dog who had wandered too close to her house. Lyddie was aware, as she might not have been minutes before, that she had no bonnet, and that her hair and braids were dusty from the road. She crossed her arms, trying to cover her worn brown homespun with the gunny sack. The dress was tight across her newly budding chest, and it hung unevenly to just above her ankles in a ragged hem. Her brown feet were bare, her outgrown boots still slung over her shoulder. She should have remembered to put them on before she got off Luke's wagon. Self-consciously, she raised her sleeve and wiped her nose and mouth under the woman's unforgiving stare. "Go along," the woman was saying. This is a respectable tavern, not the township poor farm. Lyddie could feel the rage oozing up like sap on a March morning. She cleared her throat and stood up straight. I'm Lydia Worthen, she said. I got a letter from my mother. The woman looked horrified. You're the new girl? I reckon I am, Lyddie said, clutching her gunny sack more tightly. Well, I've no time to bother with you now, the woman said. Go into the kitchen and ask Tryphena to tell you where you can wash. We keep a clean place here. Lyddie bit her lip to keep from answering back. She looked straight into the woman's face until the woman blinked and turned, running a little to catch up with the guests who were waiting for her at the main door. The cook was as busy as the mistress, and not eager to involve herself with a dirty new servant just when she was putting the meal on the table. Sit over there. Tryphena shook her head at a low stool near the huge fireplace. Lyddie would rather have stood after the long bumpy ride in Miss Stevenson's wagon, but she chose not to cause a problem with the cook as well as with the mistress in the first 10 minutes of her employment. The kitchen was 3 times the size of the whole Worthen cabin. Its center was the huge fireplace. Lyddie could have stretched out full length in front of it, and her head and toes would have remained on the hearth with room to spare. Built into the right side of the brick chimney was a huge beehive-shaped oven, and the smell of fresh-baked loaves made Lyddie forget the generous dinner she'd shared noontime. The trouble with eating good, she thought later, is you get too used to it. You think you ought to have it regular, not just for a treat. Over the fire hung a kettle so large that both the babies could have bathed in it together. It was bubbling with a meat stew, chock full of carrots and onions and beans and potatoes in a thick brown broth. There were chickens turning on a spit, which seemed to be magically going round and round on its own. But as Lyddie's eyes followed a leather strap upward, she saw, above the fireplace, the mechanism from which hung a huge metal pendulum. She wished her father could see it. He could make one perhaps from wood, and then no one would have to tediously turn the spit by hand. But perhaps it was something you'd have to order from the blacksmith, in which case it was likely to be so dear that only the rich could afford one. She couldn't remember seeing one at the Stevenses, and they were rich enough to own their own loom. Move, the cook said. The large woman was beginning to take the food from the fire. She gave Lyddie a quick glance. Lucky you're so plain. Guess couldn't leave the last girl be. She was ladling stew into a large serving basin. Won't have no trouble with you, will we? Lyddie picked up the stool and moved to a corner of the room. She knew she was no beauty, never had been, but she was a fierce worker. She'd proved that to the woman. Should she offer to help now? But the cook was too busy moving the food from the fire to the long wooden table in the center of the room to pay her any mind. Lyddie scrunched her body into itself and tucked her bare feet under the low stool, fearful of seeming in the way. Would all the guests come in here to eat? And if so, where should she hide? As if to answer her question, the mistress pushed through the door with a boy behind her. Hurry, she said. She supervised while the last of the food was transferred from the iron kettles into great china basins, which the cook and the boy carried from the kitchen to some other part of the house. The mistress mumbled and grumped orders, and in between complained of the guest who made herself out to be a lady when she was nothing but a factory girl putting on fancy airs. If the mistress saw Lyddie sitting in the corner, she never let on. Lyddie was glad to be ignored. She needed time and a chance to wash and change her dusty clothes. If only she hadn't worn her better homespun to travel in. The one in the gunny sack was even tighter and more ragged. She hadn't had a new dress since they sold the sheep 4 years ago. Since then, her body had begun to make those strange changes to womanhood that exasperated her. Why couldn't she be as thin and straight as a boy? Why couldn't she have been a boy? Perhaps then her father would not have had to leave. With an older son to help, maybe he could have made a living for them on the hill farm. But, hard as she wished, hard as she tried, she was only a girl. She was, as girls go, scrawny and muscular, yet her boyish frame had in the last year betrayed her. Her breasts were small, and her hips only slightly curved, but she couldn't help resent but she couldn't help resenting these visible signs that she was doomed to be a female. Even the last year before Papa left, he had begun sending her in to help her mother. She never really got over the baby's birth, he'd say. But once there was no more wool to spin, she felt as though her presence in the house just made her mother try less. One by one, the household tasks had been turned over to Lyddie, cooking and churning and cleaning and caring for the babies. For a while, her mother spun the flax. They had no loom, and paid the village weaver and spun flax for cloth. Her father had left them in a new shirt her mother had made, but that was the last garment her mother sewed. Lyddie tried to keep up the spinning, but when she had to take her father's place outdoors, she was too exhausted to try to spin and sew in the dim candlelight. Last winter she sewed one shirt. She had made it for Charlie because he too was outgrowing his clothes, and the old wool shirt their father had left behind hung on him like a nightdress. As it turned out, Mistress Cutler provided her with a store-bought calico gown. It was softer than her rough brown homespun, and fit her much better, but somehow it suited her less. How could she enjoy the garment of her servitude? She was fit with new boots as well. They pinched her feet and made her long to go barefoot, but she wore them, if not meekly, at least with determined obedience. After a few weeks and many blisters, they softened a little, and she was able to forget them for an hour or so at a time. The people at Cutler's were not so easy to forget. The mistress was large in body and seemed to be everywhere on watch. How could a woman so obviously rich in this world's goods be so mean in the use of them? Her eyes were narrow and close, and always on the sharp for the least bit of spilt flour or the odd crumb on the lip. Not that Lyddie would stoop to steal a bite of bread, but the boy, Willie Hyde, was given to snatching the last of the loaf as he carried the bread basket from the table to the kitchen. He was a year or so older than Charles, and growing like red birch, and to hear the mistress carry on, about as useless. He was sent to shed or barn or field whenever he was not needed in the tavern itself. Lyddie would not have said so, but she envied him the chance to be outdoors and out of boots so often. Mistress Cutler watched Lyddie like a barn cat on a sparrow, but Lyddie was determined not to give her cause for complaint. She had worked hard since she could remember, but now she worked even harder. For who was there to share a moment's leisure with? Who would listen to her? Who would listen with her to a bird call, stare at the sunset, or watch a calf stumble on its long, funny legs toward its mother? Missing Charlie was like wearing a stone around her neck. She slept under the eaves in a windowless passage, which was hot and airless even in late spring. She was ordered to bed late and obliged to rise early, for the mistress was determined that no paying guest in the windowed room across the narrow passageway should know that they shared the floor with the kitchen girl. She spoke rarely, but she listened intently, storing up stories for Charlie. She didn't consider writing him. She was ashamed to have Charlie see her poor penmanship and crude spelling, and besides, there was no money for paper or postage. Nothing except the calf money, and she would not spend a halfpenny of that. Indeed, at night, when she was too tired or too hot to sleep, she would take the gunny sack out from under her straw mattress and count the money in the darkness. It's like little Agnes sucking her thumb, she scolded herself. But she didn't stop. It was the only comfort she had had that summer. It was nearly September when she saw the pink silk lady again. She had come this time on the coach from Burlington, and was headed, Lyddie overheard her say at supper, for Lowell, Massachusetts. When another traveler asked her business in Lowell, she smiled and said, "Why, I work in the Hamilton mill there." "Yes," she added, answering her questioner's stare. I'm one of those factory girls." The man murmured something and turned his face toward his bowl of stew. The lady watched him, still smiling, and then, catching Lyddie's eye, smiled even more broadly, as though to imply that Lyddie was a comrade in some peculiar way. Indeed, when the men had left the dining room to go into the tap room, she stayed behind, reading a book she had taken from a small silk purse that matched her lovely dress. "I've seen you before, haven't I?" Lyddie looked around to see whom the lady was speaking, then realized the room was empty except for the two of them. "In late May, when I was headed home to the farm for the summer." Lyddie cleared her throat. She had lost the habit of conversation. She nodded. "You're not one of the family here." Lyddie shook her head. "You're a good worker, I can see that." Lyddie nodded again to acknowledge the compliment and turned again to loading the dirty dishes on her tray. "You'd do well in the mill, you know. You'd clear at least $2 a week, and," she paused, "you'd be independent." She was lying. Lyddie was sure of it. No girl could make that much money in a week's time. "It's hard work, but maybe easier than what you do here. And you'd have some time to yourself to study or just rest." "My mother's promised me here," Lyddie said quickly, because the door from the kitchen was moving, and suddenly Mistress Cutler was in the dining room. The woman looked from lady to Lyddie, opening her mouth to speak, but Lyddie didn't wait. She hurried past her into the kitchen. That night, again she counted the calf money. The lady had been lying, of course, but still, how had a farmer's daughter bought a silk dress?